mic is working. We're going to go ahead and get started. It is that time. So let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study of your word. Be with those that are sick and struggling at this time and not able to be here with us, Father, and also be with those who are traveling, that they all might be able to be with us at the next appointed time. Father, as we enter into a study of your word, help us to have just clear minds and hearts, and we are thankful for your word, Father, and the insight it provides us into your will. And as we have prayed before, just help us always to be doers of your word and not just hearers. And we're also thankful, Father, especially for our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who, as we're taught, is your word in the flesh. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Daniel chapter 7. We got a bit of a longer section we're going to be dealing with today. Again, that's Daniel chapter 7. But as we come to this chapter, I think one of the first things we need to be reminded of before we get into the text is when you read the Bible, you're going forward. You have books, chapters, verses. And that creates in us the mindset that it's all in chronological order. Well, I hate to disappoint you, it's not always in chronological order. Sometimes when you're going from one chapter to the next, one book to the next, you're sometimes actually going back in time. Now, I say that because from chapter 6 into chapter 7 of Daniel, we're doing just that. We're moving back in time. Chapters 5 and 6 we were in the time when God's people were under Medo-Persian rule. But here in chapter 7, for whatever reason, the author of Daniel is taking us back in time to when they were under Babylonian rule. And we see that right there in verse 1, where the text says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it." So as we see in the text, in this verse, the author of Daniel is taking his reader's mind to when this Belshazzar, king of Babylon, was in his first year of rulership. And it's at that time that Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind, and he goes down to write it down and relate the summarized version of it. Now, this Belshazzar that we're reading about, he was the son of Nebuchadnezzar that came into rulership after him. But more importantly, what we need to understand from this verse is that the author of the timeline, that the time frame the author of Daniel records here would have been roughly 14 years before Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. So in short, from chapters 5 and 6 into chapter 7, we are going backwards in time about 14 years. Again, the author of Daniel has his own reasons for doing that. Questions or comments on verse 1? All right. So Daniel chapter 7 verse 1 sets the stage for what is recorded in verses 2 through 12 of this chapter, where when you read these verses, one statement you see repeated a lot is looking. There are 5 different times in these verses that you see the word looking or looking into, some variation of that, where Daniel is looking into this dream and visions in his mind. And I think it's those 5 looking statements that form 5 points that reveal this next characteristic that we're going to look about in Daniel, and that is that he was a truth seeker. And in this particular section, we find what he sought truth about in this dream and visions in his mind. The first point we find about Daniel being a truth seeker in verses 2 through 5 is that Daniel sought the truth about the first 2 beasts in his vision. The second point we find about Daniel being a truth seeker in verse 6 is that Daniel sought the truth about the 3rd beast in his vision. The third point we find about Daniel being a truth seeker in verses 7 and 8 is that Daniel sought the truth about the fourth beast in his vision. Fourth point about Daniel being a truth seeker, verses 9 and 10, he sought the truth about the Ancient of Days in his vision. And finally, the fifth point we find about Daniel being a truth seeker in verses 11 and 12 is that he sought the truth about what would happen to the beasts that were in his vision. We'll talk about all these things as we work through the text, but in application, what we will learn is that we too must be these truth seekers. Now, let's go ahead and read through verses 2 through 12, and then we'll look at these points. Again, this is Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 2, we read, Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his wood like pure wool. The hair of his head like pure wool, His throne was ablaze with flames, its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. So again, this is a longer section we're going to be looking at, but I hope you notice those looking statements that were repeated throughout these verses, and that's what forms these 5 points that I just mentioned. But the first point is about Daniel seeking the truth about the first 2 beasts in this vision. And that point is introduced in verse 2. What does Daniel see? There in verse 2. Okay, he's looking into his vision, but what does he see in his vision? The 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So this 4 winds of heaven idea, I think that's one of the first things we need to understand here, is a phrase that symbolically refers to God's judgment being carried out. So we have the number 4 here. Now, when we talk about, more in addition to what we talk about with the 4 winds of heaven, in some cases, the number 4 refers to the 4 points of the compass. Now, what are the 4 points of the compass? North, south, east, and west. So that is used here, and it's talking about stirring up the great sea. Now, that's something else we need to understand here. Now, in Scripture, this term, the Great Sea, has one of 2 possible meanings. In some contexts, it refers to the Mediterranean Sea, which is there on the coast of the land of Israel. But in other contexts, the sea can be an image used to refer to all of humanity. In this case, and the humanity aspect is seen in passages like Isaiah 57, verse 20, and in the New Testament, we also see it used in that way in Revelation, chapters 13 and 17. Here, this seems to be the humanity aspect. So the 4 winds of heaven, God's judgment is coming down and being carried out against humanity is the idea here in this symbolic language. Questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. We are going to move kind of quickly, so but if you need me to slow down, just stop me. So verse 3, what does Daniel see next? 4 great beasts. Where are they coming from? Out of the sea. Now, if the sea is humanity, and I do say if, these beasts are coming up out of humanity. So we ask, well, who are these 4 great beasts? Well, we're not going to spend time with verse 17, but verse 17 tells us that these are 4 kings that are coming up out of the earth, 4 kings that will rule at points in history. So this is what helps us to see that the sea language is humanity. It's not the Mediterranean Sea. Questions or comments on verse 3? All right. So verse 4, we begin to see what the first beast was like. What did it look like? It was a lion. What are other things that are told to us about this beast? It's an eagle. And what happened to the wings? And what happened to those wings? They were plucked out. It was lifted up from the ground, and what ends up happening to it? Stood up on 2 feet, and it's given a mind like a man. So it's this lion, bird-like creature that takes on human characteristics. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand from the language being used here is that the animal-like features of this beast are used of Nebuchadnezzar in other Old Testament passages, such as in Jeremiah 4, verse 7, and we also see this language in Jeremiah 49, verse 22. But the text says its wings were plucked. It's an idea that refers to Nebuchadnezzar having for a time lost his power. We read about that in Daniel chapter 4. But then it takes on this human mind. It's made to stand on 2 feet. This is a further reference to Nebuchadnezzar having been restored to his power after losing it for a time. And again, that's in Daniel chapter 4, where we read about that. Questions or comments on verse 4? It is pretty graphic. This is very much painting a very vivid picture. So that's beast number 1. Verse 5, we move on to beast number 2. What does it look like? A bear. What do we know about bears? They're big. They're ferocious. That's true. So that's part of the picture being painted here. It's very fierce. But what else does the text tell us about this bear, just in the text? It had 3 ribs on its mouth, and then what is it told to do? Get up and eat its fill of flesh. The New American Standard has arise and devour much meat. So since that's true, what we should understand is that second beast is one that now represents the kingdom of Persia, or Medo-Persia as it was known at the time. So without getting bogged down in these details, I don't want to do that, but the description given here of this kingdom is one that describes the fact that this kingdom was fierce, especially in battle. Now it's for this reason that it's given this command to arise and devour much meat. Now if this does represent the kingdom of Medo-Persia, this is a very accurate description of it, because one thing we know from history about the kingdom of Persia is that it conquered a lot of different places. And 3 of those places are represented by these 3 ribs. The main places that Persia conquered were Babylonian, a nation called Lydia, and Egypt. And that seems to be what's in mind with these 3 ribs that were between the bear's teeth. Questions or comments on verse 5? They were pretty ruthless. So, yeah. Anything else on verse 5 about the bear? Okay. So, looking at this in the context of Daniel being a truth seeker, the point we should see from verses 2 through 5 about Daniel being a truth seeker is that Daniel sought the truth about the first 2 beasts in the vision. Now, again, he's looking into this vision, and he wants to know. And so he's looking into this vision. He kept looking into the vision. He didn't turn away from it. He could have turned away from this and I said, I don't want to see this. But he kept looking into it. Now that brings us to the third point about Daniel being a truth seeker, and that's that he sought the truth about the third beast in the vision. This is where we run into our next kept looking statement. What does he see? Okay, he sees another beast and it looks like a leopard. What is this leopard? The 4 wings of a bird on its back. What else? 4 heads. And what was it given? Authority to rule. But it has 4 heads. Now we've already talked about the number 4 here. It's repeated twice. And what's significant about the number 4 in the biblical context? What does it represent? We just mentioned it. The compass, the 4 points of the compass, north, south, east, and west. So here it's applied to this leopard-like creature who's allowed to rule. And in this particular verse, it's ruling over the whole world. The north, the south, the east, the west. I don't know if I moved my hands in the right directions there, but that's what I was trying to get at there. So what is said about this beast and the fact that this beast probably refers to the Greek Empire, and what is said here refers to the vastness of the Greek Empire. But we have to ask, well, why is Greece represented by a leopard? First, let me ask this. What do we know about leopards? They're very fast. Okay, they're very fast, they're cunning, they can hide, they're stealthy. One thing Greece was known for, as far as how the empire came about, it very quickly conquered the places it conquered, under the leadership of the one history knows as Alexander the Great. Now, I don't know everything about Alexander the Great, but he was known for how quickly he carried out his conquest. And that might be why Greece here is represented by a leopard, because leopards are very fast. Questions or comments on verse 6? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 6 about Daniel being a truth seeker is that he sought the truth about the third beast in his vision. Now, as with verses 2 through 5, here in verse 6, the author of Daniel has shown that Daniel continued to look into his vision. Again, he didn't turn away from his vision. Instead, he continued to look into it. Now, that brings us to verses 7 and 8, the third point about Daniel being a truth seeker, and that's that he sought the truth about the fourth beast in his vision. So again, now we arrive at the fourth beast. What are we told about the fourth beast in verse 7? Terrifying, dreadful, and extremely strong. What else are we told about it? Had large iron teeth, and what did it do to the other beast? Crushed and devoured them. And trampled them underfoot. So what does that all mean? That it trampled them and did all these things. right? So it destroyed these other empires, basically. So if these do represent empires, who are we talking about? The Roman Empire. So with that being true, with all that information being true, one thing we should know here is that the characteristics that Daniel describes this beast as having are characteristics that have in common with each other the fact that this beast was stronger than the other three. But we're also told that it had 10 horns. Now, what we should also notice here is that this is the only one of the four beasts that is not compared to an animal, but is instead put in a category all of its own. There's no animal language here other than that it was a beast, had horns, but it's not compared to a specific animal. So what this helps us to understand is that this fourth beast does represent Rome, and verse 24 of this chapter tells us that the 10 horns this fourth beast had were 10 kings. But we're not done. We go on into verse 8. What happens? Another horn comes out, a little horn. What does it mean when something is little? They might say it's undeveloped, but what? It's small. Very simply put, little is small. It came up among them. And what happened to 3 of the other horns? They were uprooted before it. And now we're told something else about this little horn. What did it have? It had eyes. What kind of eyes? Like the eyes of a human being, and it had a mouth uttering great boast. Now, what are boasts? Braggings. They're arrogant words. Look what I can do. Look who I am. Look how great I am. It is that this horn was arrogant. So one thing we should understand here is that verse 24 of this chapter is something that also helps us explain what is said here, because verse 24 tells us that this little horn refers to a king that would conquer 3 other kings, symbolized here in verse 8 by the 3 of the first horns being pulled out by the roots. So this king would violently conquer the 3 kings of verse 24. But this was a human-like horn, because it had this mind to think like a human and a mouth to speak arrogantly like a human. So putting verses 7 and 8 together, the point we should see here about Daniel being a truth seeker is that Daniel sought the truth on the fourth beast. In these verses, the author of Daniel has again shown that Daniel was searching for truth in the things that he saw. In doing so, the author shows Daniel is contemplating the things that he saw, especially when it came to the horns this beast possessed. As a result, Daniel would continue to see more truth. Questions or comments on verses 7 or 8? Right. They were pretty frightening. Right. He did stick to it. Anything else before we go to verses 9 and 10? Okay. Verses 9 and 10, we come to our next kept looking point. Daniel sought the truth about the Ancient of Days. Now, here in verses 9 and 10, we're moving away from the beast, but what does Daniel see in verse 9? Thrones that are set in place. Who does he see? And who's this Ancient of Days person? It is God. But why call him the Ancient of Days? He's eternal. That's what this title is about. Forever, eternal, whichever word you want to use there. So he's called the Ancient of Days here because he's eternal. But why use that title for him versus anything else? Okay. Okay, now what was eventually going to happen to the four beasts that we just talked about? The four beasts, just all of them. What was that eventually going to happen to them? They're going to die and turn to dust. That's not going to happen to God. So that seems to be why he's referred to as the Ancient of Days, because there's a contrast being drawn here between his eternality, I'm not even sure if that's a word, and the temporality of the beast. So this Ancient of Days title for God, it's one we only find here in Daniel. It's one we only find here in this chapter 3 times. But then we have the appearance Daniel gives of God as the Ancient of Days. What does he look like in this particular case? And what does that indicate about God? Purity. When you run into this color white in the Bible, it's a symbol for purity. It's the idea that God is pure. But then we have an appearance of his throne. What does it look like? No, his throne. And what does fire sometimes represent in the Bible? Okay, pure, in some cases, yes, but what else? Destruction. It's also judgment. So it's the idea of God sitting on his throne. He's carrying out his judgment, and we'll run into this more in verse 10 here in just a minute. But then we also have this idea of God's throne having wheels. And at that day and time, in Daniel's time, it was very common for thrones to have wheels, for them to move around. But even the wheels are on fire. But fire in this case is a picture of judgment. Anything else on verse 9? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, white associated, that might be true. So, are you talking about like somebody's old? Right. Okay.
This is a person who he is not a Johnny-come-lately like these other people were.
Right.
This is somebody who's always been.
He has always been, that's true. Right. So again, that's what that Ancient of Days is about, the eternality of God. Anything else on verse 9? Okay. So verse 10, this fire imagery continues. Now what are we told with the fire imagery? A stream of fire. Now if fire is judgment and there's this river of fire, what does that indicate? It's running. God's judgment is being carried out. What else is happening here in verse 10? What's the scene? Okay. And what does the end of the verse tell us? Court sat, the books were opened. Now what is this books being opened idea about? The book of life is somewhere our mind might go. So what's in these books? Book of life is just one of them. They might say knowledge, but if judgment is being carried out against humanity, what does that have to do with these books? Hey, the people that are in the books, that's part of this. The ones that go to heaven, that's the book of life idea. But it's records. It might be. It's a record of all of humanity. Now, this is imagery just being used, but these books that are being opened, it's like, okay, let's look at people's lives. Let's see what they're doing. Let's see what they've done. We see that imagery over in Revelation. Now, this is just a side note, but I think it's important here. If you put Daniel and Revelation just side by side, there's a lot of parallels between the two books. One of these is this book's imagery. It's a picture of these many people that are with God, looking at these books, looking at what people have done, and looking who's going to be judged, looking at who's going to spend time with God. And again, the book of life is just one of those books. And we read the parallel to this in Revelation 20, verses 12 through 15. Now, again, that's just kind of summarizing verse 10. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 9 and 10 about Daniel being a truth seeker is that Daniel sought the truth about the Ancient of Days. Now, in these verses, the author of Daniel showed that Daniel sought and wanted to know the truth about the Ancient of Days. And what was revealed to Daniel is that this Ancient of Days, who is God, was going to carry out judgment against mankind. And more specifically, from the context, this Ancient of Days was going to carry out judgment against the beast of verses 2 through 8, and do so from his throne that was ablaze with flames. Now that brings us to the fifth and final point we're going to explore about Daniel being a truth seeker, and that is that he sought the truth about what would happen to the beast in his vision. So here we run into that next "I kept looking" statement. And what does he see here in verse 11? Mm-hmm. And the beast was killed. So he's still hearing these boastful words, whatever they were. We're not told what was being spoken. And that was until the point that he saw this beast being slain. And what happened to the beast's body in this verse? It was destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. Now, when we read this kind of language, what do we think of? Hell. Don't be afraid to say it, but it's the fires of hell. It's where God casts people away from his presence. And in this case, it was because this beast was being pretty arrogant in the things he was saying. And so that's what Daniel is seeing happen. Questions or comments on verse 11? That's been said. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's true. So that's part of the idea here is just people being offensive to God are going to be thrown into this burning fire. Anything else on verse 11? Okay, so verse 12, what happens next? Okay, so their authority is taken away, but their lives are prolonged for a period of time. Now, verse 11 was about the fourth beast specifically. Verse 12 seems to be about the other three beasts before that beast. So this carries with it the idea that the authority of the rest of the beasts was taken away, but they were allowed to continue to live for a specified period of time. In other words, what is said here refers to the fact that the authority of the kingdoms represented by the rest of the beasts in verses 2 through 8 was taken away, but those beasts were not completely destroyed. Instead, what happened to them is that they were allowed to live on, but only for a period of time. We're not told how long. But they were not in those positions of authority. But even though this is the case, eventually all four of the beasts would be completely destroyed, since the text clearly states that they would only live for a time that would be appointed by God. Questions or comments on verse 12? Okay. So the point we should see from verses 11 and 12 about Daniel being a truth seeker is that Daniel sought the truth about what would happen to the beast in his vision. Now in these verses, the author of Daniel has shown that Daniel was seeking for the truth about the fate of the beast of his vision. As a result, it was revealed to Daniel that they would suffer through God's judgment. More specifically, it was revealed to Daniel that these beasts would be destroyed, even though three of them would be allowed to continue to live for a certain period of time. So when we consider everything that's been recorded in Daniel and put it in that context of his character, the point we should be left with here is that Daniel was a truth seeker. He sought the truth about the first two beasts in his vision. He sought the truth about the third beast in his vision. He sought the truth about the fourth beast in his vision. He sought the truth about the Ancient of Days in his vision. Finally, he sought the truth about what would happen to the beast in his vision. Application to us, as I mentioned earlier, we too must be truth seekers. Now, based on what we've studied in these verses, we're reminded that, like Daniel, we must be about seeking truth. I know you've heard me say that many times before, but we need to be reminded. But how are we going to be truth seekers? Well, like Daniel, we must keep looking in order to find truth. Now, in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus promises that if we are seeking for truth, we will find it. As a result, if we keep looking and keep seeking for truth, God will reveal to us the truth that we are seeking to find. Ultimately, if we want truth, we go to Jesus. Well, why? He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now again, that's just some application of this text to us. Any other questions or comments? Right. That's true. Sometimes people find truth and they don't want it. So that's a good point to make. Any other questions or comments? All right. Matt, will you close this today?